So again, thank you for joining us for the third of three talks by Aspen Decker about the history of the Salish. I'm so grateful that you've done this for us. It's really added a unique dimension to this exhibition, which I think is already very potent and compelling, so this is kind of an extra special thing. And given that this is the last week of the show, I also want to extend my gratitude to the other two participating artists, Stella Nall and Monica Gillis Brings Yellow. They are all terrific. So Aspen's work, which is all here, it falls under the umbrella of contemporary ledger art, even though it's depicted on vintage maps, right? And contemporary ledger art is, of course, well, maybe not of course, I don't know how many people really know the history, but it's a revival of an art practice that started in the mid-1800s, most prominently by a group of Plains Indians who were arrested by the US military and incarcerated at Fort Marion in St. Augustine, Florida. But of course, you know, the renderings that they did on these old ledger books were just an extension of a much longer and more enduring tradition of hide painting that went back thousands of years, where you know, history would be recorded and events and ceremonies and important rituals would be captured. Hide paintings were used for, you know, many things. And I guess if I'm stammering, it's because I'm in the presence of a real scholar and trying to sort of give a summary of ledger art, which is too broad in its strokes. But the point, the reason I bring it up at all is that you know, there's important historic context for Aspen's work that goes beyond just the subject matter that is depicted in these pieces, and which I think she's going to be talking about for the most part tonight. But you know, the art form itself has an important historic context that I think is not always is sometimes lost on people. I guess I know that from experience, having sold a fair amount of ledger art and sent people home with these kinds of works over the years. It's really a fascinating subject, and if you want to know more about ledger art, there's lots that can be found about it. There's some good resources online, there's some good books. It's really a kind of a fascinating sort of niche genre. I know I'm very taken with it. And in fact, our first show next year is going to be an all ledger art exhibition with work by 5 or 6 artists who are all in Montana or very closely connected to this area. And in fact, we're going to kind of carve out an area in the gallery to have a sort of year-long presence for ledger art. Aspen will be a part of that, so you can look forward to seeing and hearing more from her in 2026. What else did I have? Well, I guess I should just get to it. So Aspen has a bachelor's degree in tribal historic preservation and a master's degree in linguistics. She is a fluent Salish speaker, and for numerous organizations, in numerous venues, for numerous audiences, she has illuminated Salish culture, always with incredible grace and insight and intelligence. And let's give a warm welcome to Aspen.
Thank you all for coming back to listen to my talk. Is anybody new or that hasn't been to any of the talks? Oh yeah, a couple. Yeah, well, Jason explained already what ledger art is, so I don't really need to, you know, kind of refresh on what that is. I guess one thing that I'll just note before I get started for the 2 new ones is about the faces, because that's like a big question that I get often. And so the faces aren't seen in ledger art because, unlike more European portraiture art, it's more about identity being tied to your family designs, so beadwork, regalia, which tribe are you from, and what family are you from is really the way that we correlate to our identity. Oh, no. And so today I'm going to be talking about more of the history of the early on reservation era. So instead of getting into all the policies and kind of more of the later 1900s, I guess, history that's happened, I'm going to kind of stop at around when the Dawes Act and white settlement came to the reservation. So I'm going to talk more about the Khoikhoi, the buffalo, and after the removal. And so talking about the Arlee Band and the Dawes Act, the white settlement, and then some of the horse races that happened in Arlee. So that's kind of more of the later. You can see some of the cars are from like the 1930s. So some of the picture references that I used, a lot of the cars were from around that time. And so it kind of faded out around, like, I think the 50s is kind of like the last of the horse races, the Khoikhoi in Arlee. So now going back a little, I'm going to teach you all some signs. So some signs that go along with some of these pieces and the history. So one big one that I've been kind of using, I think at every talk, has been the Khoikhoi. What's that mean? Anybody know? Yep, the bison, the buffalo. Khoikhoi. Can everyone do that? Khoikhoi. Khoikhoi. And so I'm going to really focus on those Khoikhoi because they're a big part of that early reservation era. And all the way back to time immemorial, they've been an integral staple food and sustenance for our skedli, for our people, for our housing, our regalia, our food. Pretty much the entire buffalo has uses that we used. So yeah, the Khoikhoi, let's see, Shat-at-itza. I'm going to tell his story. So it's a little falcon robe. And his dad, at-at-itza. So anytime we make a bird sign, you just kind of make the flap. And then it depended on like how big the bird is. So a smaller bird, you just kind of keep your hands in. So Shat-at-i, I can make this sign for little. Shat-at-itza. You just kind of need to make like one flap. Shat-at-itza instead of flapping. Yeah. And then eagle, big birds, you touch like your head for the bald eagle. P'k'kain. 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 Saying it has a white head. And then the milk'kanoops, the bald or golden eagle, you can make the sign for the wingspan. And then the tail, because it's talking about that brown tail for the golden eagle. Milk'kanoops. 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 And now, so those are just a couple of the signs. Our sign for like a language is like a bunch of words or a story. Smimi or in. Now, so let's do Khoikhoi, buffalo again. So I want to see all of you making that Khoikhoi. 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 And in Kootenai, we say, Kam kukus iyamu. So it's a lot longer. Kam kukus iyamu. Kam kukus iyamu. Kam kukus iyamu. Khast. Yep. Enough. All right, let's do the Khoikhoi. Khoikhoi. Khoikhoi, kam kukus iyamu, kam kukus iyamu. And when we use those signs, it helps you to slow down a little because a lot of times in English, it's a lot faster pace. But in Qalichts and in our Salish language especially, it's a lot slower, and it's because our vowels are drug on longer. And so instead of focusing on the consonants to drag out the words, we focus in that in between. For Khoikhoi, you can tell that the A, I, the vowels are being like emphasized. And that word buffalo, what I really love about it is it has the Salish language vowel harmony. So that's where the vowels harmonize. So Khoi is the root of that word, black, because when we're looking out in the plains, There are these black dots, so many blacks, a lot of black. Kwai, kwai. So kwai becomes kwai, kwai, AI, kwai, kwai. So you'll notice that with some of our words where they harmonize together. And so it really just helps with the flow of the language and that song, so it all comes out naturally. And depending on what consonant's near it, it might change. And now, kind of blend.
In my excitement, I actually missed it.
Oh, yeah. You guys will really have this kwai kwai down by the end of this. No. All right, let's all make our kwai kwai. Kwai kwai. Kwai kwai. Kwai kwai. Yes, you want to have that kind of a curve. Kwai kwai, because if you make it straighter, it might be more of the sta'an, like the antelope. Now, so you got to have kind of that bent. Kwai kwai. And your fingers kind of make that like loop of the horns. Kwai kwai. Kwai kwai. Yes. It's good. You know, make that a good sign. Chest.
I got it!
Chest. Or chesmimi. It's a good story. Chesmimi. Or when trading with each other, you can make a good trade. Ches nechonowach. Ches nechonowach. Now, ches nechonowach. So let's see. I'm going to start back about chat'atitze. So going back to just after more of our traditional life ways of going and harvesting the buffalo and then having that first contact with the first settler and Lewis and Clark, following that, there was a lot of change. And so we got removed from the Bitterroot Valley. And I have an entire piece that's collected by the Montana Museum of Art and Culture. That's my Bitterroot removal. It's the Bridge of Tears Bitterroot Salish removal piece. And that's the depiction of the Bitterroot Salish removal. And so in that piece, if you make it over there, you could check it out, because I think it's going to be on display until like September, and a few of my other pieces. But that one, it showcases us crossing this bridge. And so this Bear Tracks Bridge, when we crossed it in 1891, it used to have like that old style bridge where it had like the metal, and so I added that in there. And when I was going to start on that piece, I stood on the bridge and took pictures as my reference of like where's the orientation of the mountains and the river. And so that's where I kind of decided on my layout. And instead of having some of the soldiers in there with their guns, I decided to keep them out. And so in a lot of my work, you'll notice it looks beautiful, but some of them are really hard histories. And that's because I deliberately decided, instead of having sort of, the sad depictions, I guess, it was more about like making sure that I have the resiliency of our people, and these stories still need to be told. So with that piece, it showed that removal of Chief Charlot's band. And so before that, going back to reservation era, in 1855, we had the Hellgate Treaty signing, and so that was with the Bitterroot Salish, the Upper Kudlispe, and the Kasanka, the Kootenai. And so we were at the Council Grove to sign this treaty, and it took 3 days of negotiation to finally come to like an agreement on this treaty. And so after this, we kind of got left alone. We got to go back to the Bitterroot Valley. But then following that, a lot of the first white settlers started to come into the Bitterroot Valley. And so that's where they started talking about the removal and us needing to move to the Flathead Reservation. And so the first set of Salish families, Bitterroot Salish families, was this Arlee band. And so they left in 1871, between that, did you know? It's in the 1870s. I'm forgetting the exact date, 1871 maybe. But they left because it was kind of like an order of like, okay, you need to move to the Flathead Reservation. And at that time, having all these white settlers, it was already changing the seasonal life ways, because as soon as we had kind of this influx of people moving in, the way that we sustained ourselves was having that respect, reciprocity, and relationship with the land, and knowing how much to take without depleting resources. And so when we had this influx of people coming in, they started harvesting too many deer and all the fish. And so it became more difficult just to practice our regular routines, our seasonal round. And so Arli, Lee, he got promised that you'll have cabins and you're gonna have food and all these things when you get to the reservation. And so because it was difficult at that time, he and other families decided to make the move before Chief Charlo and the entire band moved. So when they headed to Sladli, can you all say that? Sladli. Sounds like Ardley, but Sladli, and it's something to do with a little man. Sladli. So anytime we make this and have this barred L at the beginning of nouns, it usually indicates it's something small. Sladli. And so he and those families, they were removed and went to the Inskak, the Jocko Agency, which is what the reservation was called before Flathead Indian Reservation. And in this piece, I wanted to show also references to our coyote stories. Because in Arli and actually around our entire Salish Aboriginal territory, all of the place names and the geographical features usually has some kind of coyote story tied to it. So how did that form? How did it come to be? How did we get all the watersheds? And for Inskak, for Arli, there was this coyote story that I can't tell right now because it's not winter time. But essentially, it had this monster where Arli was the belly. And not saying too much, I guess, but like the monster, it was like invisible, and Coyote didn't know he was going in because it looked exactly the same as the outside world. And so that's why I have this kind of mirroring of the teepees, because it's that reference of like having that monster, and now it looks the same. And so it also is also representing like the people, the bands that were there. So Sladli, the reason why it kind of derived into Arli was because the first white the Frenchman that came through, they couldn't say his name correctly. And so they were trying to say Sladli, but then they used a false cognate, which means like using a word from your language that sounds similar. And so they decided to use Henry, Henri, can you say it better, Lisa? Are you fluent in French? Henri, yeah. So there was kind of like their false cognate. They were like, oh, you sounds kind of like Henri Sladli, and then it essentially derived into Arli. And for our dialect here, Sladli, Arli, and we don't have R's in our language here because it kind of faded out over time. And when I was in linguistics, I did kind of this research paper where it was looking at the R's and why there's no R's in our dialect, but the other Salesian bands have an R. So within our Salesian language family, there's 23 languages, and under those, there's up to 14 bands, tribes within that. And so we're the furthest inwards, aside from the ones that are kind of merged with us, like the Helena band and the one that was like in Great Falls area. But it's just not common that a language would start to use R's over L's because it's the least, or it's more restrictive. So R, in all these world languages, R kind of sometimes turns into L's over time. And so that's where it kind of shows that our language started to shift into L's instead of R's. So the Spokane, Kalispel, Bitterroot Salish were categorized as one language. And so our sister tribe, the Spokane, they still have their R's. So they say Muriamistin, and we say Madliamistin for medicine. They say Murinkip, and we say Maninkip. So it's just like this R to L change. And so a lot of these dialectal differences are really slight, so I could still understand like a lot of interior Salish bands. But anyway, there's Arli. I'm like wondering too, like did we still kind of have some R's at that time? I don't think so. I think it kind of shifted by then. And we also had this other change where I was looking at the chin to tin and the kin, because over like Okanagan up in Canada area, they say kin for I. And then we had in the Bitterroot Valley, we used to say tin, tinnes, I am. And then it changed to chin, chinnes, and only using chin. So tin to chin, and then it's like what's the most restrictive and least restrictive. So anyway, I really geek out about this kind of, they talk about the Proto-Salish, but I'm also thinking about what's the oldest Salish, or where does it indicate our movement? And so it's really kind of unknown, but I know that our plants and our place names, those are like the oldest Salish words, because some of them are from the last ice age. They reference all those coyote stories. So those are really old words, and a lot of our other Salish bands, they sound really close with their plant names, because those are those native plants that were here. And I was actually just talking to somebody today about the plants, because I did a chuchuyet, this rose hip piece with some butterflies for the new hospice center. And we were talking about the plant indicators and kind of what they reference, what they mean when they come up. So that chuchuyet being the symbol that it's time to go move over to the kwai, to the buffalo, to hunt them. It's kind of like that sign that it's ready, the river's ready, it's a good time to travel over the Continental Divide. And so with a lot of those native plant names, a lot of times I think that there was like a lot of misconception, I guess, with like the documenting of these native plants. And so when I did some different translation work for native plants, there was some on the list for Montana native plants that we don't have a word for. So that told me that we didn't even have this plant here. It's actually an invasive, or at least came later, probably during the time of settlement. You know, they probably brought it over with their wagons, or, you know, just that traveling and bringing seeds. And so it kind of changed the landscape before we even documented it very well. So I think that's where they're like, oh yeah, this daisy is native or something, when those weren't here, because we don't have the word for it. And if other indigenous bands like the Kootenai Blackfeet, they don't have the words, then it just shows you that wasn't in this area, because we have a word for everything around us. And if we don't have it, we created a new word. Now, so going back to the Slodli, our Lee band, they were the first ones on here. And I have this cradle board that I did, and that's actually my my great-grandmother's cradle board. So my yaya, my grandma, and her siblings all use that cradle board. So you could see this real cradle board that's fully beaded at the top at the Nine Pipes Museum. So if you go in there, yeah, it's in the glass, and it has the whole story of my kache, my great aunt, and how they tried to get this cradle board back, because it was kind of just out in this, I guess, out in all these different auctions. And so he got it back for her. And so there's this whole story. So if you ever make it there, go see this cradle board. So a lot of these references to beadwork, sometimes I'll you just see like these old photos, or like also create a whole new regalia based on certain florals and geometric symbols that we have in our tribe. So that's where it's just keeping that likeness, and what's like the typical colors of our ribbon dresses, and like how we wrap the shawls around us. So there's a lot kind of in these families right here of looking at like what we were wearing at that time. So the time of having more materials introduced and using that, and then having more of the squeak, the porcupine work, and then shifting into beads and beadwork. So a lot of these signs, or these symbols and designs, they were done with squid, and then we started using beads, as well as a mix of beads and squid, the porcupine quills. Now, and so in the mountains, I wanted to show kind of the place. And so it's not too common that you see mountains in ledger art, but a lot of contemporary ledger artists, they kind of have their own kind of ways of doing their artwork and how they explain their storytelling. And so some of my art, you'll notice some mountain ranges. And so I wanted to show that this is Arlie, and it has this dancing boy, and then the heart of the monster of this story. And so I wanted it because, these two teepees are referencing that monster, but so is this area of the heart of the monster. And so these mountains and that range, and where there's the dancing boy, he looks like a little powwow dancer. All the Arlesians, Arlie people, like we know that's like kind of the big symbol icon of Arlie is dancing boy, Tladli. And so you'll notice it on this horse race one, just the dancing boy. So following those families, the removal of 1891, that was a big shift for us, and especially after that 1855 Hellgate Treaty, it's where traditional leadership kind of changed too, as far as the narrative of who's the chief. And so back then there was multiple leaders, a lot of women leaders, and all these people who were very particularly chosen because they focused on something kind of like your occupation. Like if you were a botanist, you were the medicine person or the astronomer. So there was all these leaders that helped to sustain the people, and they had their roles of we need to ask that person for certain things. And so until the Hellgate Treaty happened, they decided not to let any of the women sign their names on the treaty, even though our leader women were there having their say and helping with the negotiations. But they were like, you are women, you don't get to sign. And that's a bummer because there was only 18 of the male leaders who got to sign the Hellgate Treaty. And then after following that Hellgate Treaty, they nominated in a way the main chiefs, and then had maybe one sub-chief or two sub-chiefs, but that was it. And then so they didn't, acknowledge all these other leaders within the tribe. And so it was that way all the way up until the removal to the reservation. And we had sort of this chieftain system where it was like, here's the main chiefs, Custada, Chief Charlo, Chief Alexander, the Upper Kootley, Spe, and the Kootenai. And then it started to shift into more of having a judge. And so in like the late 1800s was when it shifted into having that judge. And there's actually a Salish guy who became like the first judge of our tribe. And he was known as like this 90-day, I forgot what they called him, just like Mr. 90 Days or something, because he like always just was like 90 days for anybody who came in and was like in jail. And so there's just all these kind of, stories around who got all these positions. Like my great-great-grandfather, he was one of the first translators for the BIA, the Bureau of Indian Affairs. So he was translating the Salish to English. And so everyone kind of had these new contemporary roles, but we still held on to that traditional life ways, still going and harvesting and gathering. And so being on the reservation, we had sort of this time of not really being able to seasonally travel as much, but we still did it. And so that's where I'm wanting to tell the story of Tlatatitsa, about the buffalo, because it's a huge part of our culture, as well as the buffalo and these animals and the things that they were filling at that time. Because it wasn't just us that had this major change and having all this assimilation and genocide. It was also the buffalo, the Khoikhoi, and we have this deep relationship with them. And so I want to tell their story because they're a big part of that early reservation life and just how drastically it changed. So I'm going to tell this story. Now the story is about Atatitze. Atatitze. It's a skultamir. It's kedli skultamir. His name was Atatitze, and that means falcon robe. And epskulpachent es. Wakax ho itluchchaum. Epskulkudle. Kudkastudlich. Hotakeb hui kwai. Atatitze. He was out at some of our last hunts, and he started to realize that there's not very many buffalo left. So as our schedule started to go to get the buffalo, it drastically started to, we started to see less and less of the buffalo. So when we went one year, I should say too, traditionally we had over thousands of buffalo to sustain our people for the winter months. But one of the times we went over there, there was like 100 buffalo that we were able to harvest. And we went back over another year, and there was only like 27, 30 buffalo. And then the following year after that, there was only 7 that we were able to get. So then our leaders decided we're not going to continue to go over the Continental Divide to hunt the buffalo because there's hardly any left. And it's just kind of not worth it for us. We had all these other allied tribes that also came with us, so they were also looking for that sustenance. And it was a big part of that seasonal round, that travel for months. So it had to be kind of worth it for us to go over there. So Atatitze, he thought, he had sort of this vision, and he said, you know, I'm noticing these buffalo, they're starting to pass away. There's not many left. What could we do about this? So Atatitze, he had this vision, and it was to bring back baby buffalo calves to the reservation to help keep them safe, to help them grow. He went into the lodge, the Salish, and he mentioned this to the Idlid Lamechum, the chiefs, and he said, so he went and pled why we need to bring these little chukutla back to our res. He clamped idlid lamechum as commerciant amech whatsois shitlu hastin quan unach chwach ois ta hot shekwe kwai chamet is luchchaum. So half the people, they thought that's a good idea. It's, I think, a good vision. But a lot of them decided, no, we don't want to bring those buffalo back here because then we're doing what the Suyapis, what the white people did to us. We're stealing them from their home, and we want to leave them because they love it in the Chilchewum in the plains. And so this went on for like a couple of days where they're trying to, what should we do? And at some point, Atatitze just kind of withdrew his request because there was not enough people agreeing to go get the chukutla. He clamped the put the commercials and quietly who had squasset. Which is the hot stone and could knock some Cassiap Sini to quay. Cassiap Sini shiltum. Pen quinch spent lids. So Atatitsa, he went back and he shared why it's important still with his family, with his son, with his kids, about why we should do that and his vision. And so it kind of instilled that intention of going to get the koi kwai. But then after so many years, he died. He kwempt skoset Atatitsa. Kulpachen tashimi so ultois. Let's always talk a cousin test koi kwai. Chicks hoy so chat nam to wet so us koi kwai so yes studly. So Atatitsa, he wanted to follow through with his adla'el, with his father's vision. And he decided, I'm not going to care if some people aren't okay with bringing back the buffalo. I'm going to do it. I'm going to follow through with this vision because he believed in it. He claimed, hoy, ekebchtzin, was chimped out. Hoy, es nesam chewum. Es shad lud lud smog, os tepum lud huichweus, ka. Uhoy asadlitlani, slipum, upulsentam, asadlitlani. So Atatitsa took off, and by that time we already had our horses equipped. He took off, and he went over our typical trails, over the Continental Divide. Just come in when he got hungry, he'd just go hunting, go fishing. It's in Twet in the river, he'd go fishing. Hoy, es amstam, es at least in them, es in them kench. Es in stelsich, tamis, lo koi kachamin. Hoy, es in mutlum, lo sewil. So as he got thirsty, he used the kwai, the buffalo antlers, as a way to get his water, just dropping it into the intwet, and it fills up, making that mutlum. It's the onomatopoeia sound of like that water filling up, and mutlum and hoy, nice and stealthy, when he got thirsty, he would do that. So it was this long journey, but he knew how to take care of himself because we were able to hunt and get our own food by the time we were only like 3 to 5 years old. By the time you're 10, you're able to go get your first koi kwai. So he was already a warrior. Hoy, yotlu ati. He made it all the way over to the Chilchew. Was kamistam lo koi kwai. Tap chwechwe. Upen weed is lo chkudla. Chmapadla. Chitlanaksam was stadlawisam. Uquicked stama. Quicked koi kwai. Tassen ta amstam. So when he got there, he looked around. There weren't many koi kwai, but he noticed some of these chtamapala, these orphan calves. And some of those other koi kwai, female koi kwai, they weren't feeding the baby. They were just leaving it because it wasn't theirs. So he started to herd up all these little bison calves that he saw. He saw around 7 different buffalo calves that were chtamopadless. He rounded them up. So as he started to head back, it was around like fall time, so it was getting a little colder, chilly, and it was also kind of dangerous in that time because there was already a lot of suiuyapi, a lot of white people around, and it could have been enemy tribes, so he really had to watch himself, and bringing back those babies was also something he had to watch out for was predators that wanted to come, snatch up these chukutla. So that's the way it was all the way back to getting to our reservation. Unat kochi huitlucha as tichulam quails as chamenchis luchkudla as siat luchkudli and pipiatsum. And he got back to the reservation. Everyone was happy to see those babies, those chukudla. He even stopped over at the mission church, and Quailx, the black robe there, he was excited and he wrote about when those babies came through there. So he was happy to see that chukudla too. He went back over to where they had their home on Flathead River. These buffaloes, they started to grow up and then they mated and there was more and more buffalo. But he took off, he went somewhere, and his mom, she remarried with a new guy, and I'm forgetting what his name was exactly. It was something about a coyote, running coyote, but anyway, that coyote, Sunchalep guy, and when Tlata Titsa was gone, his stepfather, he wanted some money for those kway. He quamped Pablo u Allard as huitlucha in Slaicht, as huitlucha sinudlud limt and ufsewis hut upinchla opinchtkan, tas me stand, pin hui udlud lim called asente to kway. So at that time, Allard and Pablo, they came here to Missoula. And by then there was a bank here. And so they requested a loan. And so they got this loan. I'm forgetting how much that amount was. But that stepfather, he said he wanted stacks of cash. He didn't want like a check. It just like had to be, money, udlu udlim. So they brought this money to him. They laid it out. We're gonna buy these kway from you. By the time Little Falcon Robe came back, all the buffalo were gone. And so he sold them out from under him. But that story is really important because it was the way that we brought buffalo to our reservation, and it's the way that the buffalo were saved. Because the U.S. government, they had a deliberate campaign to wipe out all the buffalo. And so it dwindled to hardly any, from millions, 20 million or so, to only less than a few hundred. And so our herd from Tlata Titsa and what Allard and Pablo grew to being around 600 kway or more, they were the buffalo that repopulated all these different national parks. So the Yellowstone buffalo, they were that direct strain, that natural strain from there, and they populated there, the bison range, all these different places. And I realized that my story was kind of long. Anytime I talk in Salish, it's definitely a lot longer. So just to kind of, speed up this reservation era. after we got our reservation, we were doing really well. We had around 25,000 horses and 27,000 stama, the cows, and around the 600, 700, 800 buffalo. And they were growing fast. It was like every year they multiplied, and we were growing this huge kwai herd. We were doing well because we were able to still have our sinkaitin, our traditional lifestyle of encampment. And so as soon as this happened right here, the Suyapi settlement, it changed everything, and we had to sell the buffalo. This is the piece that's done on an 1887 map of Montana from the Dawes Act of 1887. And so this shows the cabin and our teepees, which is kind of showing these two worlds of still having our encampment and having, the cabins. And so those cabins were what were promised to Thadli for all the people, but there was a lot of broken promises, kind of broken treaties of what they promised. And so it just shows how things rapidly changed for us. We went from living our seasonal round, our nomadic life ways, to going to the reservation and still traveling, but then how we changed into having that cultural adaptation, and we're doing great, doing well for that time era too, with all the cattle. And they wanted us to have more farming, and we did it. We had more horses, we had all these cattle and buffalo. And then I think they saw that this land was beautiful, that there's the lake there, and then they already took all the rest of the Aboriginal homeland, and then they wanted to start taking of our land on our reservation. And so opening it up after this Dawes Act, they decided to give every family a chunk of land. And they didn't give them the best land that they thought anyway. It was like the land that was against the mountains. And so the prime farmland they saved because the Indian agents at that time knew that they were going to open it up to white settlement. So they gave all the Indians kind of like, the outer edge of the reservation, which I think is the best part because we're, by the mountains. But they opened it up. And so that's what led to Allard and Pablo having to sell the buffalo herd. And so there's so many cool stories that go on with like the buffalo and our way of being around that. But essentially they sold it. And then only like 20 years after that, they decided, we need to have a national bison range to, revitalize or have this preservation of the buffalo. And so then they brought back the buffalo that Tlatatitsa had sold, or not Tlatatitsa, but the Pablo herd, it sold to Kalispell, and they brought it back. And so if they would have just left the buffalo be, I bet we could have, had thousands and 100,000 by now. So anyway, this whole representation is the people. I mentioned that last time, that circular round is just like our encampment. It's our presence here. And then this was just the rapid change of opening up our reservation to everyone else. And so there's a lot more history that I could tell, but that's just sort of that first early on glimpse of the reservation era. So, thank you all for coming and listening. Should we have questions? Sorry.
Questions, does anyone have any? I'd like to understand, you made a reference to, I can't tell that story because it's not winter. Can you elaborate on that concept? Are there certain stories that can only be told certain times a year?
Yeah, for our people, any of our skwadlumt, our coyote stories, oral stories, the older ones especially, they could only be told in the winter months when there's snow on the ground or when the first lightning storm comes. And so different elders will say different things. So one is that the Simhope, the first snow on the mountains, is when you could start. But then others will say as soon as the pop or the kind of popping of the eshit of the trees, like the sap pops, that's when we know that it's time to tell coyote stories too. So it's a couple of different sayings, but it's definitely when there's snow on the ground. And one thing that I got asked before too is what about climate change and what's going to happen when there's no snow? And so my response is that the time of the winter is the time of dormancy. It's the time for the people to also be quiet and listen and rejuvenate for all this seasonal travel. So I feel like even if snow is here at some point in our lives, it's still the same time of dormancy, and I feel like that's still just our time of telling stories.
Is it not true that the herd was sold to Canada and then they had to bring them back because they didn't have any in the States at some point? And it was from St. Albert.
Yep, they actually tried to sell it to the United States government, but that was just before their campaign of let's kill them all. And at that time, they were also allowing people to buy tickets to just kill as many buffalo as they can while they were in the train. So there was all these carcasses, wasted meat, and everything was wasted. And so they had the opportunity to buy it, but then the Canadian government decided to purchase it. And I actually met this indigenous man from up in Canada who's Nadane, and he said that we had this funny kind of connection where I was like, oh, you come from the people of the buffalo. And so I was like, yeah. And then he's like, I was like, yeah, I was sad, they got removed. But then he was like, oh, they were gross. Like they were all sickly and we didn't even want them. And so it's kind of sad because it's just like what happened to the buffalo along the way. A lot passed away. A lot of them got sick and were sickly because, they were put in these little carriages. They made actual buffalo wagons to get them to the train, and then they're just in these like small spaces. So a lot of them they had to shoot, or they just passed away. So there's a lot that went into the trauma of the buffalo too. So the buffalo are similar to us in the narrative of like what happened.
Do you have time to just tell us a little about those horse races?
Oh yeah, sorry, totally, just didn't have time. Well, this Ko, there's actual pictures of like this, like the races that happened in our lease. So it's kind of like near where the schools are, and there's like the baseball fields, and like in Kusum is where like all of this Ko happened. And so we had all these horse races, and there was actually a lot of women too that were jockeys, horse jockeys. So I wanted to depict just the women riding the horses. And so a lot of times when we rode horses too, you just grab onto the mane, and we actually still have Indian relays and Indian horse relays where you have like 4 people or so, and as soon as they're running to that next area where they hop on, they just hop right up on there, take off. So our people have always been just really good with horses, I think, and growing our horses to being like what Lewis and Clark and them said, the most beautiful horses, and getting to that 27,000 horses or 25,000 horses. We were horse people, and they became a big part of our culture. So yeah, kwai. Yeah, this is my horse tricks, but like the buckskin horses that you see, I actually grew up with my buckskin horse, and he had socks on too, so you'll see that a lot in my art, is just this buckskin horse. And we also had a paint horse that looked pretty similar to this one. My sister still has him. He's getting pretty old. But yeah, horses, horse culture, and riding in the mountains has been a big part of my upbringing. So I love to include horses because, it's just a big part of our culture, and they're just beautiful animals. So I'm not no.
I was going to say that the bitter root removal piece that she referenced, that is going to be on a mural around the electric station down there, those big ugly red walls. We're putting art on those. And one of the north wall is going to be all ledger art. This is going to happen in October 13th is going to be the ribbon cutting, so plan for that. Aspen's bitter root removal, which is going to be so beautiful because you'll be able to see the bear tracks in the background and then this image of this historic image. So it's looking forward to that. Wow.
Thanks.
And then this is currently at the art.
Yep, at the moment.
Yeah, and that show closes when?
September sometimes, or early September, I think.
End of September.
Oh, end of September, okay.
She's a docent for the
Yeah, I have 7 other pieces there if you want to go see those.
Show the 19 under 39. If you haven't seen that, make sure you go see it because it's really exciting and to see how much talent and young people there are right now. So.
Yeah, we should give Jason and Lisa a round of applause for your latest arts award. It's amazing. Yes.
Well, thanks again for coming.